He was born into royal privilege, yet King Edward VIII's reign ended in absolute infamy. Although he's gone down in history as the man who sacrificed everything for love, the true story of his life reveals a much more complicated and chilling truth. And it's not what happened during his reign that's the most shocking, because when Edward VIII's baby brother, Prince John, died of a severe seizure at only 13 years old, Edward's response was so disturbing, it's impossible to forget. But did you know, Edward's name wasn't what you think it was? Born on June 23, 1894 to the future King George V and Queen Mary, the royal family was very tight-knit. So although Edward's official name was Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, yeah, try saying that 10 times fast, his parents and close friends just lovingly called him David. But soon, those family dynamics would turn very dark. Like all royals, a series of nannies brought up the children. Yet when it came to his own nanny, Edward was hiding a dark secret. His caretaker was so possessive, she would pinch him just before he saw his parents, making him cry and sending him right back to her. Of course, as soon as Edward confessed the horrific treatment, the nanny was fired. But some say the damage was already done. Let me pause and ask you a question. What's the best birthday gift you have ever received from your parents? Well, for Edward, he got a pretty strange gift on his 16th birthday. He officially became the Prince of Wales. You see, in May 1910, his father ascended to the throne as George V, and he gave his son the title a little over a month later, along with the royal designation of the Earl of Chester. Sadly, all the official names in the world couldn't hide one unsettling fact. He wasn't ready to be king. Plain and simple, the new Prince of Wales was like a fish out of water. He was woefully unprepared for his responsibilities. Now, before he became the heir, Edward wanted to join the Navy, but once his father ascended as king, those plans turned to dust. Instead, his parents expected him to get an academic education at Oxford, and they enrolled him immediately. It did not go well, however, because Edward had one big flaw. While at the Magdalen College in Oxford, Edward became more of a party boy than a princeling. He loved playing polo with his friends on the university grounds instead of hitting the library, and when he left Oxford after just 8 terms, he had almost no academic qualifications. Strap in though, this is not the only thing that may come back to haunt Edward. Now, when World War I broke out in 1914, Edward was a hot-blooded young man and naturally wanted to fight for his country. Although Parliament kept England's heir away from most of the fighting, Edward went regularly to the front lines to witness trench living, and that's where he picked up a more scandalous habit from the soldiering life, because whenever Edward got leave, he beelined it right to Paris to party. His late-night actions would have shocked his parents, and while in France, Edward's friends introduced him to the high-class courtesan Marguerite Alibert, who he immediately fell into lust with and struck up a passionate affair. But before long, this connection came back to haunt him. Now, although Edward and Marguerite flamed out after only a year, she returned into the prince's life with vengeance, because in 1923, Marguerite shot and killed her husband in the swanky Savoy Hotel in London, and Edward's PR department had to kick it into 6th gear to make sure his name never came up in the trial. But how surprised would you be if I told you this would be far from Edward's last controversy? Around this time, the Prince of Wales became an international sensation. Good-looking and in love with a good time, the Bachelor Prince was a heat score for the newspaper. As Men's Wear magazine pointed out, quote, "The average young man in America is more interested in the clothes of the Prince of Wales than any other individual," quote. But behind closed doors, he wasn't so picture perfect. The young Edward had a type when it came to the ladies, and that type was ruinous. He soon developed a penchant for married women and also seemed completely uninterested in settling down like a responsible member of the royal family. These disturbing traits led Edward's own father to remark, quote, "After I'm dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months, quote. He wasn't wrong. But we'll get there after I share Edward's dirty little secret with you. Edward met the woman who would drag him kicking and screaming into the annals of history, Wallace Simpson. At the time, Wallace had already been divorced once and was still peskily married to the businessman Ernest Simpson. Meanwhile, Edward himself was still visiting his mistress, Thelma Furness's bedroom, but did any of that stop them? No. Wallace Simpson and Edward's relationship began as a dirty little secret. In fact, after years of flirtation, they struck up their steamy liaison while his mistress, Lady Furness, was out traveling abroad. When they did finally get together, the couple tried to keep it hush-hush for as long as possible, but as we all know, the truth always comes out. Edward became smitten with Wallace because of her strong personality and the irreverence she showed towards his royal status. Within only a year of their relationship, Edward was already, in the words of his biographer, slavishly dependent on Simpson. The feeling was mutual though, as Simpson had fallen in love with Edward by August of 1934, but right now we are only at the tip of the iceberg. To be fair, Edward tried incredibly hard to keep Wallace as a secret, even in the face of one very embarrassing encounter. When his father asked about his relationship to Wallace, he lied through the skin of his teeth, despite the fact that his father's staff had caught the couple in bed together and saw evidence of a physical act. Now that is a commitment to a lie. Now, when Edward's affair finally came out, he shoved it in his parents' faces with a scandalous stunt. Prince of Wales decided to introduce Wallace to his traditional mother in the middle of a formal Buckingham Palace function. Even though the palace didn't usually invite divorcees inside, his mother was utterly outraged, and she eventually got revenge of her own. As you can imagine, Wallace Simpson didn't make the best impression on the king and queen during her visit to Buckingham Palace, because when Edward tried to bring her to another event soon after, the royal couple fully denied their son and refused to see the divorcee. Talk about ice cold, but maybe his parents were actually onto something. Wallace Simpson was certainly into Edward, but that doesn't mean her reasons were completely pure, because when she met the Prince of Wales, her marriage to Ernest Simpson was in tatters, largely because he didn't make enough money to fund her extravagant tastes. Edward, however, had all the power and the money of the monarchy behind him. Talk about a gold digger, but what if I told you there was another red flag? Simpson was never the most faithful wife, but it must have really cut like a knife when she started straying from Edward, too. Rumors swirl that during their time together, Simpson was also entertaining an adventurous commoner named Guy Marcus Trundle. The thing is, he wasn't even her most infamous conquest, but more on that later. Now, Edward loved showering Wallace with clothes and jewels. Moreover, Wallace apparently didn't even have a taste when it came to jewelry, and people often commented on how she ruined her elegant outfits by putting honkin' jewels right on top of them. With Edward now fully head over heels for the scandalous Wallace Simpson, the government's biggest nightmare happened. Edward's father, King George V, passed on January 20th, 1936. This meant that Edward, messy affair and all, was now King Edward VIII of England and the head of state, and he wasted no time proving Parliament's worst fears. The very next day after his father's passing, Edward threw an egg right in Parliament's face by insisting on watching his own accession announcement alongside his mistress, Wallace Simpson. After all, he considered himself fundamentally non-traditional. From then on, the government knew they were in for a wild ride, but they didn't know just how wild it would get. The government went to desperate measures to save themselves from Edward's tyranny. Ministers avoided sending sensitive documents to his home at Fort Belvedere, and their reasons were chilling. Not only would the new king shirk his duty and barely look at them, many were afraid that Wallace Simpson and her fun-time friends would take a peek at them and expose the government's secrets. But did you know the government almost got out of this wild ride? Because on July 16th, 1936, less than half a year after he was crowned king, Edward's life almost ended in one violent act. That day, an Irish ne'er-do-well named Jerome Bannigan tracked Edward down while he was riding horseback and pulled a gun on the young monarch. Now luckily, or unluckily, depending on how you look at things, Edward's security detail neutralized the would-be assassin. The attack left Edward shaken, but it didn't help him make better decisions, because on the fall of 1936, it became clear that Edward was desperate to marry Wallace Simpson. In October, the Simpsons even brought forward divorce proceedings to the British courts, and on November 16th, Edward formally told the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, that he intended to marry his mistress. And this proposition couldn't have gone worse. You see, as king, Edward was also the head of Church of England, which did not look well upon divorcees, and saw it as nothing short of sacrilegious that Edward wanted to make Simpson queen. Even when Edward proposed a morganatic marriage that wouldn't give her the title of queen, Parliament and the Church still said no. In other words, Edward was now backed into a corner. Even as Edward was getting public pressure from the government about his love life, his mistress Wallace was getting the same pressure in secret from Edward's own family. The king's lord-in-waiting, Lord Brownlow, even approached her and pressured her into renouncing the king in a statement, and this heartless act only made Edward all the more determined to marry her. In the end, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin gave the King of England 3 options, and none of them were good. First, he could give up his fantastic notion of marrying Wallace Simpson. Second, he could marry her against Parliament's wishes and start pandemonium. And third, Edward could give up the throne. They were excruciating options, and no one actually expected the choice he ended up making. Against all odds, Edward gave up his crown, officially signing the abdication papers on December 10th, 1936. So just like his late father, King George V had predicted, Edward VIII hadn't even made it a year as king. Nonetheless, it seemed like a heartwarming act of love for his soulmate Wallace. But Edward's scandalous history was just getting started. On June 3rd, 1937, Edward made good on his promise and married Wallace Simpson in a quiet and private ceremony in France. Yet, even this happy day started with bitterness. The Church of England still refused to have anything to do with their marriage, so they had to get a small-town clergyman to perform the ceremony. But that wasn't the only drama. Instead of celebrating his brother's big day, King George VI banned all royal members from attending the ceremony, including Edward's closest friends. Both Edward and Wallace felt this slight for the rest of their lives, and Edward never managed to forgive his brother for the cruelty. But as it turns out, he was known to be pretty cruel himself. Back in 1919, Edward's first response to his baby brother's death was to complain. Yeah, you heard that right, but what he said was so bad, it put a rank taste in people's mouth. But first, I have to tell you about the rivalry he had with his other sibling, the newly crowned king. Because after that fateful day in December 1936, Edward's brother Albert succeeded him to the throne as King George VI. And for his first act as king, George wanted to grant his older brother the title of the Duke of Windsor, only there was one selfish motive behind this act. The title Duke specifically gave Edward 0 political power, neutralizing him on the playing field. But Edward's wife, Wallace, also got a mean slight, because another royal slight to Edward and his new wife came when the newly minted George VI refused to let Wallace Simpson be styled Her Highness, the Duchess of Windsor, in society, even though she was now married to the Duke. Former King Edward was incensed at this personal vendetta against the woman he loved, and he sure let George know it. While campaigning for his wife's titles, Edward would telephone his brother nearly every day, needling and pestering him to reconsider. Then again, Edward also used these calls as an opportunity to ask his royal daddy Warbucks for more money for his allowance. And it got so bad that George VI eventually ordered his people not to forward any of Edward's calls. Now around this time, Edward began treating his own mother, Queen Mary, in incredibly cruel ways. He expected his mother to step up for him and lashed out when that didn't happen. In 1939, he even wrote her to say that her last letter, quote, destroyed the last vestige of feeling I had left for you and has made further normal correspondence between us impossible, quote. That is a harsh thing to write to your own mother. Granted, Edward's mother despised his wife, because Queen Mary made no secret of her dislike for Wallace Simpson, lawfully wedded wife or not, and she refused to meet the false Duchess for as long as she lived, at least in formal company. Her words were even more brutal. The Queen, positively indignant over her son's abdication, once huffed, to give up all this for that. Now eventually, Edward must have realized that marrying Wallace put him in a gilded cage. For one, Edward's brother, King George VI, paid his allowance out of his own pocket for a good long while. This meant that Edward had to please his brother, not himself, if he wanted to survive, which wasn't something he was used to. But one day, it came to a disturbing climax. Edward was banned from England. Yeah, you heard that right. In the aftermath of the abdication, Edward and Wallace lived in semi-exile on the continent, so when they wanted to return home, they got a rude awakening. King George VI forbade them, even threatening to cut off their allowance if they came home without an invite. That was the end of that, but it was also the beginning of the most infamous period of their lives. Because in 1937, Edward and Wallace made their most controversial move yet, and it's an act that is still looked on with horror today. To the absolute shock of the British government, they traveled to Nazi Germany and actually had a meet and greet with none other than Adolf Hitler. Perhaps worst of all, they even gave the full Nazi salutes. But boy, the circus show was just getting started, because Hitler liked Edward VIII and thought that if the infamous abdication hadn't happened, things could have been much different. To quote Hitler directly, he said, "I am certain through him permanent friendly relations could have been achieved. His abdication was a severe loss for us." But if you think that's bad, hold on to your hats, because the Duke's letters from around this time reveal a disturbing truth. He wanted to take back his crown. In the late 1940s, George VI's health was ailing, and the Duke of Windsor took full advantage. In his correspondence, there's evidence that he planned to sneak back into England and set himself up as a regent for his sick brother. The thing is, it came closer to happening than most people know, but not in the way that you might think. Because in 1940, there was a Nazi plot called Operation Willy to persuade or even kidnap the Duke of Windsor and make him work for Adolf Hitler. Now we know today that it didn't work, but many scholars agree that the German state was fully prepared to reinstate Edward as a fascist ally king. Now how long that would have lived on for is a great question, because Edward had some problems that he kept behind closed doors. In the 1960s, Edward's once glamorous life slowed to a near halt. His health started to deteriorate, and he had a series of surgeries for various ailments, including his aneurysm abdomen and a detached retina. And a bit later in 1971, he found out that he had throat cancer as a lifetime smoker. The end was near, and it was tragic. In his final days of life, Edward was too weak to even hold on to the last vestiges of his royal dignity. When his niece, Queen Elizabeth II, visited in 1972 while she was on state business in France, she managed to speak to her uncle for 15 minutes, but only Wallace was feeling well enough to accompany Elizabeth for a photo opportunity, while the ailing Edward stayed inside. Just 10 days after Queen Elizabeth II visited him, the former King Edward VIII passed from throat cancer in his home in France, just a few weeks away from his 78th birthday. And in death, he did what he could never do in life. He returned to Britain for good, and to this day his body lies in Windsor Castle. But what about his beloved Wallace Simpson? Well, Wallace Simpson outlived her infamous royal lover by over a decade, and she chose to be with him when the end of her life came too, because after living out the remainder of her years as a recluse, she passed at the age of 89 in 1986, and per her last wishes, attendants buried her next to Edward on the royal burial grounds at Windsor Castle. Now, that sounds like a happy ending, until you hear about Wallace's secrets she kept during her life. According to FBI reports from the 1930s, Wallace started an affair with the German officer Joachim von Ribbentrop. And if we are to believe the whispers, she also kept his signed photograph on her bedside table. Not only that, but according to the man who ghost wrote her memoirs, Wallace actually admitted that a childhood friend, Herman Rogers, was the true love of her life, although she made the writer swear to never print the confession. Now, despite their dark pasts and hidden secrets, we still tend to see King Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson as a love story for the ages. Now, hearing that the last 10 years of Edward's life was full of ailments and sickness, it might make you start to feel for Edward. But do you remember when I said Edward had a rivalry with multiple siblings? Well, back in 1919, Edward's brother, John, who was 11 years younger, passed away from a severe seizure at just 13 years old. Edward's response was so disturbing it's impossible to forget. He referred to John's passing as, quote, "a little more than a regrettable nuisance," quote. And that wasn't all. When Edward heard of John's tragic fate, one of his first responses was to complain about John to his mistress at the time, as he wrote to her, quote, "This poor boy had become more of an animal than anything else," quote. And Edward was also so savage to his mother about the loss of her son that he later had to apologize to her for being a cold-hearted and unsympathetic swine. Now, out of everything you have just heard, what do you find most surprising? Is it Edward's relationship with Hitler, his raunchy past, his cold-hearted nature? Let us know down in the comments below, and if you want to hear more about various historical figures, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any more jaw-dropping stories like this one.